Where I'm going is that in this approach, we don't buy conventional wisdom. But I'm very happy to say something in 2011, that this is not just a philosophical stance on our part. This is following the research literature, and not the literature of the last 5 to 10 years, but believe it or not, 50 years of research in the neurosciences that has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that conventional wisdom is wrong about these kids. In other words, that they don't lack the will to behave well, as conventional wisdom suggests. They lack the skills to behave well. The best way to think about these kids is that they have a learning disability of sorts. Except this learning disability isn't in areas that we customarily think of when we think learning disability, reading, math, writing. This is a learning disability in different areas. Areas like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. These are kids who are delayed in the development of critical skills related to problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance. Or they have those skills, but have significant difficulty applying those skills when they are most needed. I think it's a very helpful analogy to think of this as a learning disability, and let me just be clear that that's how we're talking about this. I'm not saying this should be defined formally as a learning disability in school settings for legal terms, etc. What I'm saying is this is a very helpful analogy for a variety of reasons. One reason is, let's not forget that it was not that long ago that we completely misunderstood kids with what are now recognized learning disabilities. So in 2011, if a kid here, let's say in the 5th grade, was struggling to read, looked more like a 2nd grader or 1st grader in terms of their reading in 2011, what would be the primary explanation? What would people think? The educator would wonder what if that kid wasn't reading? I wonder if he has dyslexia, reading disability of some kind. Would they have thought that 40 years ago? No. What would the predominant explanation have been 40 years ago as to why that child was not reading? He was not smart, or he was lazy. So he was dumb or he was lazy. And if he was dumb, that explanation would lead to this intervention, which is, I better put my efforts elsewhere, because he's going to be bringing up the rear anyways. Or he was lazy. And of course, what have we learned at this point in time? The sad irony is, who was trying harder than anybody else in that class to read? That child who was struggling to read. The kids who read easily, comes naturally, they don't try very hard. I've seen this with my own kid. If you learn to read easily, you don't try very hard. It just happens. Who has to try really hard? The kid to whom it doesn't come naturally, ironically. Of course, what's the relevance here? We think behaviorally challenging kids aren't trying very hard. Oh no. The well-behaved kids don't have to try hard at all. It comes naturally. The kids that don't have the skills to whom it does not come naturally, they're the ones who are working overtime to behave well. So similarly, we used to completely misunderstand those kids. Now, I'm not saying that every school in North America is well equipped to help remediate learning disabilities with the best evidence-based practice that's available, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a classroom anywhere, for instance, in North America, where an educator would see a kid with a massive gap in reading and not wonder, does this kid have a learning disability, and treat him as such instead of thinking he's lazy or dumb. Now, if you're struggling at all with this notion of this being a developmental delay of sorts, or a learning disability, if you want to use that analogy, just think of it this way. What do we call 2-year-olds? We call it the what?
Terrific twos.
The terrific twos, and they are terrific, aren't they? Twos are awesome. And yet we also call them the terrible twos. And do we call them terrible twos, much as we might feel this way at times, but do we call them the terrible twos because 2-year-olds are pathological, awful, deviant little beings? Or do we call it the terrible twos because they are miserable at tolerating frustration, being flexible, and problem solving? The latter. Now, do we get terribly concerned with a 2-year-old who's inflexible, can't tolerate frustration, and has poor problem solving strategies? No. Why? Because they're 2. And the nice thing is, most kids, by the time they're 4, look better than 2 when it comes to tolerating frustration, being flexible, and problem solving. And a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old look better and better and better and better. But some kids, they're 6 and they look like they're 2. Or they're 9 and look like they're 4. Or they're 14 and look like they're 6. Or they're 19 and look like they're 5. You name it. But in all cases, what is that? Just a developmental delay. between where neurotypically developing kids are in certain skills related to problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance, and where this kid is. In the early going, you know, when a kid is 4, 5, and look like they're 2 or 3, they're still cute, they're small, and we can see that it's not that long ago that it was okay to look like that, and we tend to treat them empathically and as though this is a developmental delay. Not when they get older. You get a 15-year-old who looks like a 6-year-old, people aren't treating them the same way, even though all that is a larger developmental delay. Now, I know that we have some folks here who work in educational settings. I love working with teachers because here's what I say to teachers, and it's going to make it sound simpler than it is. Treat challenging behavior like you would any other learning disability, and you'll be in great shape. And what do I mean by that? Ask any educator, what do you do with a kid who you suspect might have a learning disability? What's the first thing they'll say? What's the first thing you do? I just heard somebody whisper it. Test, assess. And why would you test or assess? Well, because you're not going to know what to do to be helpful until you figure out what skills the kid lacks. And then once you figure out what skills the kid lacks, do you go back to teaching them the exact same way you did before you did the testing?
No.
No. What are you going to do? You're going to use a different approach to teach that kid the skills that he or she lacks in increments they can handle. But they're going to require a different approach. And in a nutshell, that's all we're talking about today. We're talking about treating challenging behavior like you would any other form of a learning disability, which means figure out what skills the kid lacks, and then use a different approach to teach those skills to the kid in increments they can handle. And why is that important in increments they can handle? Well, because imagine if you were the kid struggling to read, you're in 5th grade and you're reading at the 2nd grade level. Well, if you're the teacher, you might be saying, wow, that's a big gap, and I don't know if I can go right back all the way to 2nd grade, and I got all these 5th graders here reading at 5th grade. I think I'll split the difference and start teaching him at mid-3rd grade. No, that'd be silly, right? You realize you have to go back to where the kid is at and teach him forward. Same is true here when it comes to behavioral challenges. You got to go back to where they're at, teach them forward. But you're going to need a different approach because the standard one isn't getting the job done.